From the heart of Dublin's toughest neighborhoods rose a name that would one day send shockwaves across the world: the Kinahan Cartel. What started as a small family dealing drugs on the streets soon evolved into one of the most powerful and feared criminal empires in Europe. Led by Christy Dapper Don Kinahan and his ambitious son Daniel Kinahan, this Irish family built a global network that stretched from Ireland to Spain, from the Middle East to South America. Their empire ran like a multinational corporation, sophisticated, ruthless, and untouchable. They used luxury properties, boxing promotions, and fake companies to hide billions in drug money. But behind the glamour lay a trail of blood, assassinations, betrayals, and a gangland war that would leave Ireland in chaos. The Kinahan Cartel wasn't just about crime. It was about control, loyalty, and the price of power. From the streets of Dublin to the skyscrapers of Dubai, this is the real story of how an Irish family rose from nothing to become global crime bosses, and how their empire may finally be collapsing under the weight of its own brutality. This is the Kinahan Cartel empire, from Dublin streets to global crime bosses. In the gritty streets of Dublin during the 1970s and 1980s, opportunities were scarce, and survival meant making choices that often came with consequences. Among the young men growing up in this harsh environment was Christy Kinahan, a clever and ambitious street hustler who quickly learned how the world of crime worked. Dublin's underworld was full of small-time dealers and smugglers, but Christy had a vision that went far beyond quick money. He wanted to build an empire. Christy began small, selling stolen goods and dabbling in drug dealing. His early years were marked by arrests, time in prison, and an education in how the criminal justice system and the criminal world really operated. Ironically, it was behind bars that he began to transform from a street criminal into a strategist. He used his time in prison to study economics, languages, and international trade. When most inmates were counting days, Christy was counting possibilities. He learned how to move money discreetly, how to build offshore companies, and how international drug routes functioned. By the time he was released, he was no longer just a small-time Dublin dealer. He was a man with a plan. The city was flooded with drugs, mostly controlled by rival gangs, but Christy was thinking globally. He began importing drugs directly from abroad, cutting out the middlemen and increasing profits. This move earned him the nickname the Dapper Don, as he dressed sharply, moved quietly, and always stayed one step ahead of law enforcement. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, Christy Kinahan built connections in Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium, establishing smuggling routes that brought cocaine and heroin directly into Europe. These operations weren't flashy, they were efficient, professional, and deadly effective. The Kinahan name was beginning to carry weight, though few people truly understood how deep his operations ran. Christy wasn't like the traditional Irish gangsters who thrived on violence and street control. He preferred structure, control, and secrecy. Instead of fighting turf wars, he built relationships with suppliers, money launderers, and corrupt officials. His strategy was to run crime like a business, and Dublin was just his headquarters. But as his influence grew, so did the need for trusted people. This is where his family came in, especially his son, Daniel Kinahan. From a young age, Daniel watched how his father operated. He saw the discipline, the caution, and the method behind the madness. While Christy worked behind the scenes, Daniel would later become the face of the new generation, charming, modern, and globally connected. By the late 1990s, the Kinahans had built a strong foundation. Their money moved through property deals, fake import businesses, and shell companies. Their drugs reached not only Dublin, but also Manchester, Liverpool, and London. The Kinahan network was expanding, and the family name had become a quiet but powerful presence in Ireland's criminal ecosystem. But with power came attention, from rivals, the media, and the police. Christy's growing empire couldn't remain hidden forever. As Dublin's crime scene grew more violent, Authorities began to notice that the man pulling the strings wasn't always in the streets. He was operating from afar, orchestrating everything with precision. This was just the beginning. The Kinahans had moved beyond street crime. What started as one man's ambition was now evolving into an international operation. And as Christy passed on his empire to his son, the streets of Dublin would soon witness a transformation that would change Ireland's underworld forever. As the new millennium began, the Kinahan name was already whispered in Ireland's underworld. But it was Daniel Kinahan, Christy's eldest son, who would take the family empire to a new and dangerous level. Unlike his father, Daniel wasn't just a criminal strategist. He was a businessman with ambition, confidence, and global vision. While Christy had built the foundation in the shadows, Daniel wanted to turn the Kinahan operation into something bigger, more sophisticated, and far more powerful. Daniel grew up surrounded by wealth and secrecy. He learned early that loyalty was currency and trust was everything. He inherited his father's intelligence but mixed it with a modern edge, an understanding of how image, influence, and connections could protect power as much as violence could. Daniel began spending more time abroad, especially in Spain's Costa del Sol, a paradise for wealthy tourists and a safe haven for European criminals. From Marbella, Daniel expanded the family's operations. The sun-soaked region became the new base for the Kinahan Cartel, a perfect place to move money, drugs, and influence without attracting too much attention. Daniel made powerful friends: drug suppliers from Colombia, money men from Dubai, and European smugglers who controlled major ports. With these alliances, the Kinahan Cartel grew from a Dublin-based gang into a transnational crime syndicate. Daniel also understood the importance of legitimacy. To outsiders, he was a boxing promoter and businessman, founding MTK Global, an organization that represented some of the biggest names in world boxing. Through boxing, Daniel met celebrities, athletes, and influential figures, all while using the sport to clean money and expand his network. The boxing world gave him respect, visibility, and a layer of protection. But beneath that polished surface, the drug trade continued to pump billions into the Kinahan accounts. Meanwhile, Daniel's reputation on the streets was growing darker. He was known as calm and calculating, but merciless when betrayed. Those who crossed the Kinahans often vanished or ended up dead. By the early 2000s, the Kinahan family had become one of the most powerful organized crime groups in Europe, controlling vast quantities of cocaine imported through Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Their operations were tightly run, each move calculated, each deal protected by violence and silence. However, Daniel's rise also reignited old tensions back home in Dublin. The Hutch family, once close allies in the Irish underworld, began drifting away as mistrust and greed grew between them. When millions went missing from a joint deal, quiet anger turned into open hostility. What began as a business disagreement would soon explode into one of Ireland's bloodiest gang wars. Still, Daniel remained untouchable. He moved between Dubai, Spain, and the UK freely, investing in luxury properties and businesses while the money flowed. The cartel operated like a modern corporation, complete with logistics managers, accountants, and enforcers. Law enforcement agencies across Europe were aware of the Kinahan operation, but catching them was another matter entirely. The family had diversified their assets and communication networks, leaving little traceable evidence. By the mid-2000s, Daniel Kinahan was not only the face of Irish organized crime, he was its king. From the outside, he appeared to be a successful entrepreneur with international connections, but in the shadows, he was orchestrating one of the largest drug trafficking empires in Europe. Daniel had taken his father's dream and turned it into a global empire built on fear, money, and absolute loyalty. But that same empire was about to face its greatest threat, a gangland war that would put the Kinahan name on every front page in Ireland and force Daniel to show just how ruthless a businessman he could truly be. By the mid-2000s, The Kinahan Cartel had become the most dominant force in Ireland's criminal underworld. But with power came enemies, and none more dangerous than the Hutch family. What began as a quiet feud between former allies soon turned into a brutal gang war that would shock Ireland and make international headlines. The origins of the conflict went back years. Both the Kinahans and the Hutches had once worked side by side, sharing smuggling routes and profits. But greed and mistrust poisoned the alliance. Rumors spread that a multi-million euro shipment of drugs had gone missing, and both sides accused the other of betrayal. The fragile peace shattered completely when Gary Hutch, a relative of Jerry the Monk Hutch, was murdered in Spain in 2015, a killing believed to have been ordered by the Kinahans. Gary's death was the spark that ignited an all-out war. The Hutches vowed revenge, and soon Dublin became a battlefield. Drive-by shootings, assassinations, and targeted killings turned the city into a war zone. Innocent lives were caught in the crossfire as both sides sought to wipe each other out. But it was one attack in particular that would change everything: the Regency Hotel shooting. In February 2016, a high-profile boxing weigh-in at the Regency Hotel in Dublin was ambushed by gunmen disguised as police officers. Their target, Daniel Kinahan. Dozens of people fled in panic as shots rang out, and one man, David Byrne, a key Kinahan associate, was killed on the spot. Daniel narrowly escaped death, fleeing the country shortly after the attack. The brazen hit sent a chilling message. The Hutch gang had declared war, and no one was safe anymore. The Regency attack sparked a chain reaction. The Kinahan Cartel struck back with brutal precision. Over the next 2 years, more than 20 murders were linked to the feud. Dublin's streets were soaked in blood, and families on both sides lived in constant fear. Assassins were hired across Europe, safe houses were fortified, and the Irish government launched one of the largest criminal crackdowns in its history. Daniel, now operating from abroad, coordinated the retaliation from a distance. Using encrypted communications and trusted lieutenants, he ensured that anyone suspected of involvement in the Regency attack would be hunted down. The cartel's message was simple: betrayal would be punished by death. The media labeled it the Kinahan-Hutch feud, but it was more than a rivalry. It was a war for control, power, and revenge. The once profitable Dublin underworld became a graveyard for soldiers from both sides. Ordinary citizens began demanding justice as the killings became more reckless and public. The Irish police, the Gardaí, established specialized units to dismantle both organizations. International agencies like Europol and the DEA began monitoring Daniel Kinahan's movements, recognizing that this was no longer a local issue. It was a European criminal war spilling across borders. While Daniel remained untouchable in Dubai, his associates across Europe were being arrested, their assets frozen, and their operations exposed. The feud left deep scars, not only on Ireland's criminal landscape, but also on the Kinahan Empire itself. The attention was now global. Law enforcement agencies had enough reason to connect Daniel to drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder. The days of operating in the shadows were over. The Kinahan name, once whispered quietly in the dark corners of Dublin, was now headline news worldwide. And as pressure mounted and governments closed in, Daniel's once unshakable empire began to tremble. But even as the walls started closing in, the Kinahans were already looking ahead, expanding into other countries, other markets, and new ways to keep their billion-euro operation alive. The war had changed everything, and the next stage of the Kinahan story would take them far beyond the streets of Dublin. As the streets of Dublin burned with blood and bullets, Daniel Kinahan was already miles away, orchestrating the next evolution of his family's empire. While Ireland's police and media fixated on the gangland war, Daniel was building something far more ambitious: a global criminal network that stretched from Europe to the Middle East and South America. Operating from Dubai, Daniel found the perfect base for a man who wanted to appear legitimate while running one of the world's largest drug empires. Dubai was a city of wealth, luxury, and connections, a place where business could be done quietly and legally on paper, even when it wasn't. Daniel invested in high-end properties, met international businessmen, and cultivated the image of a respectable entrepreneur and boxing promoter. But behind the scenes, he was linking his cartel with some of the most powerful South American cocaine producers and European distributors. Through his contacts in Spain, the Netherlands, and Belgium, Daniel developed a complex logistics network. His operatives managed shipments from Colombian and Venezuelan suppliers, moving tons of cocaine through Europe's busiest ports: Antwerp, Rotterdam, and Algeciras. Each shipment was worth millions, and every successful delivery made the Kinahan Cartel richer, stronger, and more deeply entrenched in the global drug trade. The Kinahans had perfected the art of blending business with crime. They created shell companies in Spain, the UK, and Dubai, using them as fronts for laundering drug money through real estate, boxing promotions, and import-export firms. Millions were funneled through offshore accounts, cryptocurrency exchanges, and legitimate investments. Daniel's name began appearing in luxury property records, while his associates quietly moved cash across borders with diplomatic precision. Meanwhile, the boxing industry continued to serve as Daniel's public disguise. Through MTK Global, the company he co-founded, he gained access to some of the biggest names in the sport. Fighters, promoters, and agents traveled to Dubai, meeting Daniel and attending events that looked legitimate on the surface. It was a clever move. Boxing gave Daniel respectability and influence, making it harder for authorities to touch him without concrete proof. But as the Kinahans expanded their reach, law enforcement agencies around the world began connecting the dots. The US DEA, Europol, and the UK's National Crime Agency, NCA, started investigating how the cartel managed to move drugs across continents with such efficiency. Reports described the Kinahans as an international crime syndicate, capable of trafficking billions of euros worth of narcotics every year. Despite the scrutiny, Daniel remained defiant. From his luxury villas in Dubai, he continued to direct operations, recruiting trusted lieutenants to handle logistics and enforcement, while maintaining the facade of a businessman. His father, Christy Kinahan, acted as a silent advisor, helping manage the financial side of the empire. The cartel had become so well organized that even with multiple arrests of lower-level members, the top remained untouchable. By the late 2010s, the Kinahan Cartel had reached its peak. They had influence in Europe's ports, connections with Latin American suppliers, and money flowing through countless offshore accounts. But the same success that made them powerful also made them vulnerable. Their name was now too well known. International agencies were sharing intelligence, and the US government began to take special interest in the Irish crime family operating out of Dubai. Behind the glamour of Daniel's life, private jets, luxury hotels, celebrity meetings, the noose was tightening. The DEA, Interpol, and Irish authorities were preparing a coordinated strike. The world's most wanted Irishman was about to face pressure from every direction. Daniel had built a criminal empire that spanned the globe, but in doing so, he had drawn the eyes of the world onto himself. And as the spotlight grew hotter, the cracks in the Kinahan Cartel's foundation began to show. The stage was set for the downfall of Ireland's most powerful crime famine. By the late 2000s, the Kinahan Cartel stood at the height of its power, a billion-euro criminal empire stretching across continents, run from the luxury towers of Dubai. But behind the calm exterior of success, pressure was mounting from every direction. Governments, police agencies, and the international media had turned their gaze toward Daniel Kinahan and his family. The days of operating quietly were over. The Kinahans had become too big, too powerful, and too public to ignore. The turning point came when the United States, Europol, and the Irish Gardaí joined forces to take down the cartel. Years of investigation, wiretaps, and financial tracking had begun to pay off. Authorities uncovered the intricate web of companies, fake accounts, and smuggling routes that kept the Kinahan machine alive. They were no longer dealing with a street gang. They were dismantling a global corporation of crime. In 2022, the U.S. government made its move. The U.S. Department of Treasury officially sanctioned Daniel Kinahan, his father Christy, and his brother Christopher Jr. under the Global Magnitsky Act, branding them as key international drug traffickers. Overnight, the Kinahan name became toxic. Their assets were frozen, their bank accounts shut down, and travel across many countries became nearly impossible. The U.S. offered a $5 million reward for information leading to the arrest or conviction of any member of the Kinahan family. For Daniel, who once rubbed shoulders with world champions and businessmen, it was a stunning fall from grace. Boxing promoters and fighters who once proudly associated with him began cutting ties. MTK Global, the company he helped build, collapsed under public pressure and government scrutiny. Overnight, Daniel's legitimate image disintegrated, replaced by headlines calling him Ireland's most wanted man. The walls were closing in. European law enforcement continued to raid properties, arrest associates, and intercept shipments tied to the Kinahan network. The cartel's trusted routes through Spain, Belgium, and the Netherlands were compromised. Dozens of loyal lieutenants were either jailed or flipped into informants. For the first time in decades, the Kinahans were on the defensive. Meanwhile, life in Dubai grew quieter. Daniel stopped appearing at public events, his movements restricted and monitored. Though the UAE did not immediately hand him over to Western authorities, the city that once served as his paradise was now a gilded cage. Reports suggested that the Kinahans were living under heavy security, fearing both rival cartels and law enforcement action. Christy, the patriarch, tried to stabilize the crumbling empire, using his financial expertise to keep money hidden in offshore accounts. But even he could not stop the chain reaction. Every arrest, every raid, every leaked document brought the cartel closer to collapse. What had once been a carefully built empire was now being torn apart piece by international cooperation and relentless investigation. Still, questions remain. Despite the sanctions, the rewards, and the global hunt, no Kinahan family member has yet been extradited or convicted. Rumors persist that parts of their network continue to operate in silence, smaller, more discreet, and harder to trace. The family may have lost their public empire, but whispers of their hidden influence still linger in Europe's underworld. The story of the Kinahan Cartel is one of ambition, power, and inevitable downfall. From the streets of Dublin to the skyscrapers of Dubai, they built an empire on fear and fortune, but even the mightiest criminals eventually face the weight of justice. Whether the Kinahans are truly finished or merely regrouping in the shadows remains one of the most haunting questions in modern organized crime. And so, the empire that once ruled with blood and gold now stands on the edge of extinction, a symbol of how far power can take you and how quickly it can all come crashing down.